The California sun pressed down on the Goldwyn Studios lot like a hand over a flame. It was the summer of 1958, and Stage 8 had been transformed into a gilded cage, a replica of a luxury train car for some like it hot. The air inside smelled of sawdust, hairspray, and the particular kind of sweat that comes from ambition, mixed with fear. Technicians shouted coordinates. Cameras rolled on steel tracks. Extras adjusted their costumes for the 100th time, and somewhere in the corner, behind the lights and the laughter, a girl no one was looking at tried not to cry. Her name doesn't appear in the credits. It never does for people like her. She was 22, maybe 23, with shoulders that had learned to brace for impact, and hands that knew how to fall without breaking. Until today, she wore Marilyn's costume, Marilyn's wig, Marilyn's walk. But she would never wear Marilyn's name. In the hierarchy of Hollywood, she existed in the space between shadow and light, visible only when someone needed her body to do what the star's insurance policy wouldn't allow. She had arrived at the studio that morning at 4:30, when the sky was still bruised purple, and the guard at the gate barely looked up from his newspaper. She'd taken 2 buses to get there, standing the whole way, because sitting meant wrinkling the dress she'd pressed the night before, not the costume that would be provided, but the simple cotton dress that she hoped made her look professional, reliable, grateful for the work. In the dressing room she shared with 3 other stunt performers, she'd transformed herself into Marilyn Monroe. The wig came first, platinum blonde curls that smelled faintly of someone else's perfume. Then the makeup, foundation 2 shades lighter than her own skin, red lips drawn slightly larger than her natural mouth. The beauty mark penciled in with practiced precision. The costume came last, a shimmering evening gown that fit her body the way water fits a glass, uncomfortable and perfect. When she looked in the mirror, she saw someone else entirely. Not Marilyn Monroe, she could never be that, but not herself either. She was a ghost, a placeholder, a body that would occupy space until the real star arrived. The scene required a stumble, heels catching on the edge of a moving set piece, a controlled fall that would look accidental on film. She had rehearsed it the day before with the stunt coordinator, a gruff man with cigarette-stained fingers who'd barely looked at her while explaining the mechanics. Step, catch, twist, fall, protect your head, protect your face. Those were the only parts that mattered, the only parts the camera might catch. She had done it 6 times already that morning, 6 times of hitting the floor of the director calling cut and again, 6 times of pulling herself up with a smile that said she was fine, she was professional, she was grateful just to be here. Each fall felt like proof of her worth, evidence that she could take what the job demanded and still stand up, asking for more. Between takes she'd watch Marilyn Monroe from the corner of her eye, the real Marilyn, standing off to the side in a champagne-colored robe, her face hidden behind enormous sunglasses even though they were indoors. The star seemed to exist in her own atmosphere, surrounded by assistants and handlers who moved around her like planets around the sun. Someone held her coffee, someone else held her script. A third person stood ready with a compact mirror and powder puff, prepared to touch up her makeup between every take. The stunt girl wondered what that felt like, to be so important that other people managed the basic logistics of your existence. She wondered if Marilyn Monroe had ever taken a bus at dawn, ever pressed her own clothes, ever eaten dinner standing up over the sink because she was too tired to sit down. On the 7th take, something inside her wrist made a sound like a twig snapping under snow. The pain was immediate and total, a white-hot bolt that traveled from her hand to her shoulder. For a moment, the world narrowed to just that sensation, everything else falling away like scenery struck from a stage. She could hear her own heartbeat in her ears, fast and frightened. She could feel the cold sweat breaking out across her forehead, threatening to streak the carefully applied makeup. But she didn't scream. Women like her had learned early that screaming cost you the job. Instead, she tucked the injury against her stomach, as if she could fold the pain into something small enough to hide. Her face went white, but she stood up. She even laughed a little, that bright fake laugh that girls use when they need men to think everything is under control. "I'm good," she called out, her voice only shaking slightly. "Ready when you are." No one stopped filming. The assistant director checked his watch, calculating how many more takes they could squeeze in before lunch. A gaffer adjusted a light. The script supervisor made a note on her clip. The world continued as if nothing had broken at all. The director, Billy Wilder, squinted at the monitor and shook his head. "The fall looks too controlled. We need more surprise, more genuine panic. Let's go again." The stunt girl nodded, cradling her injured wrist against her body where no one could see. The pain was getting worse, spreading up her arm in waves. She could feel the joint swelling pressing against her skin from the inside, but she couldn't stop. Stopping meant admitting weakness meant replacement. Replacement meant going home to tell her mother there would be no paycheck this week, no money for the medicine that kept her lungs clear, and her heart beating. She took her position again, balancing on heels that suddenly felt like knives. The world tilted slightly, or maybe that was just her vision blurring with tears she couldn't afford to shed. But Marilyn Monroe, she was standing off to the side waiting for her close-up, wrapped in that robe that shimmered like champagne, and probably cost more than the stunt girl made in a year. Her makeup was perfect, the red lips, the beauty mark, the eyes lined in black that made her look like a doll someone had arranged with meticulous care. But if you looked closer, past the artifice, you would see something else. Exhaustion, the kind that lives in the bone, the kind that no amount of sleep can cure. Marilyn had been watching the stunt girl all morning, the way a mother watches a child playing too close to traffic. She recognized the rhythm of survival in the girl's movements, the way she held her breath when the director, the way she nodded too quickly when given instructions, as if enthusiasm could compensate for inexperience, the way she made herself smaller, quieter, less shrinking down to fit whatever space they were willing to give her. Marilyn knew that dance, she had perfected it in casting offices and photographers' studios, and hotel rooms where men promised her the world if she would just be a little more accommodating. She had learned to disappear pieces of herself so efficiently that some days she couldn't remember what the original shape had been. And now she watched as the girl cradled her wrist and turned away from the crew, her shoulders shaking in a way that had nothing to do with acting. The director called for a 10-minute break. Someone brought him coffee. Someone else brought him a day. The crew scattered to smoke cigarettes and complain about the heat. The world moved on, except Marilyn didn't move on. She stood there in her champagne robe, perfectly still, watching the girl try to compose herself behind a rack of costumes. She watched the way the girl wiped her eyes quickly, furtively, checking to make sure no one was looking. She watched the way the girl straightened her shoulders and lifted her chin, rebuilding the armor that had cracked. Something in Marilyn's chest tightened. It was a feeling she recognized, one she'd spent years trying to drink away, medicate away, sleep away. It was the feeling of seeing yourself in someone else's pain, the feeling of recognition that cut deeper than sympathy, that bled into the territory of shared grief. She thought about Norma Jean, the little girl who had been passed from house to house like a stray cat, never quite clean enough, never quite quiet enough, never quite worth keeping. The girl who had learned that love was conditional and survival was a performance. The girl who had discovered that the world would take everything you offered, and still ask for more. Norma Jean would have understood the stunt girl, would have recognized the mathematics of desperation, the careful calculation of how much pain you could absorb before it showed on the surface. Marilyn walked across the set slowly, her heels clicking against the wood like a clock counting down. She didn't go to the girl, not yet. That would draw attention, and attention was the last thing the girl needed right now. Instead, she stopped in the center of the stage, right where the lights converged, and pressed a hand to her temple. She swayed, just slightly, the way a candle flickers before it goes out. I need to Her voice was soft, almost apologetic, but it cut through the noise like a knife through silk. The director turned, his face already tightening with frustration. Billy Wilder was a genius. Everyone said so, but geniuses are rarely patient. Geniuses see people as instruments to be played, and instruments don't get to be tired. Marilyn, we're already 3 hours behind schedule. I know, she smiled, but it was the saddest smile anyone on that set had ever seen. It was the smile of a woman who has apologized for existing so many times that the words have worn smooth in her mouth. I'm sorry, I can't think straight. I didn't sleep. I keep forgetting my line. She looked down at her hands as if they belonged to someone else, as if they were strange objects she'd found and didn't know what to do with. I need a break, a real one. Maybe we could call it for the day. It wasn't a question. It was a plea wrapped in velvet, delivered with the perfect combination of fragility and charm that Marilyn Monroe had weaponized into an art form. Wilder stared at her, his jaw working like he was chewing on words he couldn't say. Everyone on set could feel the tension crackling through the air. Everyone knew Marilyn was difficult. Everyone knew she was late, insecure, impossible to manage. The stories circulated like currency. How she'd done 37 takes of a single line. How she locked herself in her dressing room for hours. How she required a special coach to feed her dialogue word by word. But everyone also knew that without her there was no move. She was the light the whole production orbited around. She was the reason the studio had greenlit the project, the reason theaters would fill, the reason this film would be remembered long after everyone else on set had been forgotten. Wilder's face went through several expressions in rapid succession: anger, frustration, resignation. He looked at his watch. He looked at the crew. He looked back at Marilyn, who stood there like a beautiful broken thing, waiting for his verdict. He sighed, loud enough for the whole crew to hear, loud enough to make it clear that this was a concession, not a choice. Fine, we're done for today. Everyone back tomorrow at 6 a.m. sharp. And Marilyn, he pointed at her with the kind of paternal sternness that men reserve for women they simultaneously desire and resent. 6 a.m. means 6 a.m., not 6:30, not 7, 6. She nodded, her eyes downcast, the picture of chastened obedience. Of course. Thank you, Billy. I'm so sorry. The crew erupted in a mixture of relief and annoyance. Equipment was packed, voices overlapped, people made plans for the unexpected free afternoon, and in the chaos, no one noticed Marilyn slip away to where the stunt girl sat, on a crate behind a rack of costumes, still clutching her wrist, still trying to disappear into the shadows where invisible people belong. Marilyn didn't announce herself. She simply sat down beside the girl, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The girl stared at the floor, tears dripping silently onto the borrowed costume that had cost more to make than she earned in a month. Marilyn stared at the lights overhead, the kind of lights that make you feel like you're burning even when you're cold inside. Let me see, Marilyn finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. The girl's head snapped up, her eyes wide with panic. Up close, Marilyn could see how young she was, how the makeup couldn't quite hide the exhaustion etched around her eyes, could see the small scar on her chin, the chipped nail polish, the costume that didn't fit quite right because it had been tailored for someone else's body. Miss Monroe, I'm fine, really. I just need a minute. Let me see. This time it wasn't a request. It was the voice of someone who had spent her whole life being told to smile through the pain and had decided, just this once, that no one else should have to. It was the voice of Norma Jean, the girl who remembered what it felt like to be powerless. Slowly, reluctantly, the girl extended her arm. Her wrist was already swelling, the skin turning a deep, ugly purple that spread like spilled ink. The joint sat at an angle that was subtly wrong, a wrongness that made Marilyn's stomach turn. She had seen enough injuries on enough sets to know this wasn't something that would heal with ice and aspirin. Marilyn's breath caught, but she didn't flinch. Instead, she gently cradled the girl's hand in both of hers, as if it were something precious, something worth protecting. Her touch was soft, careful, the touch of someone who understands that gentleness is sometimes the rarest gift we can offer. You don't have to pretend with me, Marilyn said quietly. I know what it's like to be afraid that if you stop smiling they'll replace you. I know what it's like to think your pain is less important than their convenience. The girl's face crumpled. The armor she'd been holding together all morning finally shattered, and the truth came pouring out in gasps between sobs. I can't lose this job. I can't. My mom is sick. Stage 4. The treatments, they're so expensive, and I'm the only one working. My dad died 3 years ago, and my brother is still in high school, and if I don't bring home money this week. Her voice broke, and she covered her mouth with her good hand, as if she could shove the words back in, as if admitting need was somehow shameful. Marilyn understood. God, she understood. The architecture of desperation was the same for everyone, only the details changed. She thought of all the times she had stood on a set, dizzy with pills and exhaustion, terrified that if she admitted she was human they would throw her away like yesterday's newspaper. She thought of the men who had told her she was lucky, who had made her feel like every opportunity was a gift she didn't deserve rather than compensation for her labor. She thought about the system that created girls like this, girls like Norma Jean had been, girls who learned to measure their worth by how much pain they could endure silently. What's your name? Marilyn asked. Sarah. The girl wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, smearing the carefully applied makeup. Sarah Collins. Sarah. Marilyn repeated it like a prayer, like an incantation. Listen to me, Sarah. This system, she gestured vaguely at the set, at the lights, at the whole machinery of Hollywood. It wants you to think you're disposable. It wants you to believe that your pain doesn't matter, that speaking up is the same as being difficult, that needing help is weakness. But that's a lie. Do you understand? It's a lie they tell us to keep us compliant. Sarah stared at her, this woman who was supposed to be just a beautiful face, just a breathy voice and platinum curls. But there was something in Marilyn's eyes that Sarah recognized, a kind of knowing that only comes from having been broken and rebuilt so many times you lose count. Marilyn stood up, smoothing down her robe, and for a moment the mask of Marilyn Monroe, the movie star, the icon, the fantasy slipped back into place. Her posture changed, her expression shifted into something brighter, more playful. It was like watching someone put on a costume made of light. She walked over to one of the assistant directors, a young man with a clipboard and too much hair gel, who practically vibrated with nervous energy. "Do me a favor, darling," she said, her voice suddenly bright and girlish, the voice that sold millions of movie tickets. She touched his arm lightly, a gesture calibrated to make him feel important, chosen. "Call Dr. Chris, Lee Chris. Tell him to come to the studio right away. Tell him it's urgent, but don't tell anyone else, just him. Can you do that for me?" The assistant blinked, confused, flustered by her proximity. "Are you okay, Miss Monroe? Should I call the studio nurse?" She smiled, the kind of smile that could launch 1,000 ships or sell 1,000 tickets. "I'm perfect, darling. I just need to talk to him about my prescription. You know how it is." She tapped her temple meaningfully, and the assistant nodded with the knowing expression of someone who thinks he's in on a secret. The lie came easy. It always did. Marilyn had learned young that the truth was a luxury only powerful people could afford. 20 minutes later, Dr. Lee Chris arrived, a kind man in his early 50s with tired eyes and gentle hands, who had seen Marilyn at her lowest and never judged. He was one of the few people in her life who seemed to understand that behind the image was a person, complicated and struggling, and worthy of compassion. She met him at the entrance to the soundstage, and spoke quickly, quietly, her words tumbling over each other in her urgency. "There's a girl, a stunt girl. She's hurt badly, but she won't say anything because she's terrified of losing her job. I need you to look at her. I'll pay for everything, the examination, the treatment, whatever she needs. But don't tell her I sent you. Tell her it's studio policy, or union requirements or insurance protocol. Tell her anything except the truth. Please, Lee. She can't know it was me." Dr. Chris studied her face for a moment, and something in his expression softened. He had seen this before, Marilyn's compulsion to save others, to give away pieces of herself to anyone who seemed to need them more. It was beautiful, and it was heartbreaking, this inability to protect herself, combined with the fierce determination to protect everyone else. "Of course," he said simply, "show me where she is." Marilyn led him back to the set, weaving through the scattered equipment and abandoned coffee cups. Sarah was still sitting on the crate, still cradling her wrist, still trying to make herself invisible. When the doctor approached, her eyes went wide with fear and confusion. "I'm fine. I don't need studio policy," Dr. Chris said gently, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being trusted. He knelt down beside her with a grace that belied his. "Any injury that occurs on set has to be properly documented and treated. It's for insurance purposes. The studio is liable if something happens to you, and we haven't followed protocol. Won't take long, I promise." Sarah looked past him, searching for Marilyn, but Marilyn had already melted back into the shadows of the soundstage. She watched from behind a curtain, hidden, as the doctor examined the wrist with careful precision. She watched as he asked questions in a low, calm voice. She watched as he pulled out a portable X-ray device from his medical bag, something he certainly hadn't brought for a simple consultation, something he'd prepared, because Marilyn had called ahead and told him what to expect. She watched as Sarah's face cycled through confusion, relief, and something that looked almost like hope. She watched as the doctor wrapped the wrist in a temporary splint and wrote something on a prescription pad. She watched as he pulled out a business card and pressed it into Sarah's good hand, speaking words Marilyn couldn't hear but could imagine. Follow-up appointment, specialist referral, payment already handled. And then Marilyn turned and walked back to her dressing room, alone. The space was exactly as she'd left it, a cluttered shrine to the woman the world thought she was. Makeup scattered across the vanity, dresses hanging on racks like empty promises, photographs of herself staring back at herself, an infinite regression of images that had nothing to do with who she really was. She sat down in front of the mirror, still wearing the champagne robe, and stared at the woman reflected back at her. Marilyn Monroe, the most famous actress in the world, the woman everyone wanted to be, the fantasy that men purchased with the price of a movie ticket. But all she could see was Norma Jean, the girl no one had protected, the girl who had learned that survival meant performance, that value meant beauty, that love was something you earned by erasing the parts of yourself that made other people uncomfortable. She thought about Sarah, about the fear in her eyes, and the way she'd tried to hide her pain. She thought about all the invisible girls in Hollywood, the ones who wore the stars' faces and risked the stars' bodies, but never got the stars' recognition or protection. She thought about the machinery that ground these girls down and called it opportunity. And she understood, in a way that made her chest ache with a pain no doctor could treat, that this was the world they lived in, a world where women broke themselves into pieces just to stay in the room, a world where admission of need was treated as character flaw.
A world where your value was measured by how much you could give before you collapsed. But maybe, just for one afternoon, she had changed that. Maybe, just for one girl, she had been the person she wished someone had been. For Norma Jean, maybe that mattered. Outside her dressing room, she could hear the sounds of the studio shutting down for the day, voices calling goodbyes, cars starting in the parking lot, the ordinary sounds of people returning to their ordinary lives. Marilyn took off the platinum wig and set it carefully on its stand. She wiped off the makeup with cold cream, watching Marilyn Monroe disappear in streaks of red and white and black. Underneath was just a woman, tired, lonely, trying her best in a world that wanted her to be either perfect or nothing. She wondered if Sarah would ever know. Probably not. And that was fine. Better, even. Acts of kindness that required recognition weren't really kindness at all. They were transactions, performances, another way of taking up space in someone else's story. The next morning, Sarah returned to set with her wrist in a proper brace, and a letter from Dr. Chris explaining that she needed modified duties for the next 6 weeks. The stunt coordinator grumbled, but didn't fire her. The insurance had been handled. The liability had been documented. Everything was official and proper, and impossible to argue with. She worked carefully that day, doing what she could, and Marilyn watched over her from a distance. Every time the director's voice rose, every time someone's frustration started to bubble towards Sarah, Marilyn would suddenly need another take, another adjustment, another moment. She forgot her lines with strategic precision. She requested lighting changes. She stretched the day out like taffy, buying Sarah time to heal, space to breathe, permission to be human. They never spoke about it direct. Sarah never learned who had called the doctor, who had paid for the treatment, who had stopped production just to protect her. She probably assumed it was studio policy, union requirements, the normal operations of a system that looked after its workers. But sometimes, Sarah would catch Marilyn looking at her from across the set, and something in that gaze felt like recognition, like solidarity, like one woman seeing another woman, and understanding exactly what survival cost. Years later, when Sarah became a stunt coordinator herself, she would remember that day. She would remember the fear and the pain, and the shame of trying to hide both, and she would build something different. She made sure every young woman on her sets had proper health insurance. She stopped production the moment someone looked hurt. She created protocols for reporting injuries, without fear of retaliation. She fought with directors and producers who treated bodies as disposable. She became the person she had needed that day on the Some Like It Hot set. And sometimes, when she was training a new stunt performer, some young girl who was trying too hard, pushing too far, afraid to admit when something hurt, Sarah would think of Marilyn Monroe, not the icon, not the fantasy, but the woman who had seen her pain and decided it mattered. The woman who had used her power not to lift herself higher, but to catch someone who was falling. The world remembered Marilyn Monroe as a lot of things: a sex symbol, a tragic figure, a difficult actress, a beautiful disaster. The woman who died too young and left behind a legacy of unfinished performances and unanswered questions. But Sarah remembered her differently. Sarah remembered her as the woman who had saved her life with a single act of strategic kindness. The woman who had understood that sometimes the most revolutionary thing you can do is refuse to let someone suffer alone. And in the end, maybe that was the truest version of who Marilyn Monroe had been all along. Not the platinum hair, or the breathless voice, or the shimmering gown, but the girl underneath all of it, Norma Jean, the orphan, the survivor, who had spent her whole life being told she didn't matter, and had decided that no one else would ever feel that way if she had the power to stop it. Some people shine so brightly that the world forgets they can burn. Some people give so much that they hollow themselves out from the inside. Marilyn Monroe was both. She was the girl who became a goddess, the orphan who became a queen, the woman who used her power not to elevate herself, but to protect those who had none. And when the cameras stopped rolling, when the lights went dark, when the world stopped watching, she was still Norma Jean, still the girl who knew what it meant to be invisible, still the girl who remembered how it felt to be forgotten, still the girl who made sure at least once that someone else wouldn't.